Sometimes I feel like the High Holy Days can be something of a mixed bag. Sometimes these sacred times really, truly inspire us towards character change and taking agency to alter the course of our lives. Sometimes it just feels like deja vu. We make the same mistakes. We're dealing with the same baggage. We're right back where we started. I was thinking about last year, 5785. At High Holy Days, we were deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, the state of our country and the world, the war, and our friends and family in Israel. And now it's 5786, and we're deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, the state of our country and the world, the war, and our friends and family in Israel. So much has changed in a year, and so much is exactly the same. This past year in Jewish life has certainly helped me understand what people truly mean when they use the old English expression, "May you live in interesting times." Israel endured a 12-day war with Iran, flare-up in hostilities with Hezbollah, the Houthis, the continued devastating and tragic war in Gaza, and a government unresponsive to the pleas and desires of the vast majority of its population that is desperate for an end to the war and a return of the hostages. Here in America, anti-Semitism continues to expand and multiply as it has for years on end. This has led to violent outcomes, with members of our people being attacked and even killed in Washington, D.C. and Boulder, Colorado. And our own temple community was most directly affected when we felt that we had little choice but to remove ourselves from Pride this year, when San Diego Pride and their board refused to listen to our plea, when we felt humiliated, cast aside, attacked, and unsafe, when they made the irresponsible decision to headline a performer who had endorsed and promoted messages calling for violence against our people. A recent study has shown that rates of depression have increased substantially in the Jewish community in response to anti-Semitism experienced and perceived by our community. These are indeed interesting times. When I thought about what message our community needs to hear on this Rosh Hashanah, I thought about the story of Franz Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig was born in 1886 in Kassel, Germany, to an affluent but minimally observant Jewish family. He entered university in Freiburg and Berlin, where he studied history and philosophy and was quite brilliant. Although Jews had achieved emancipation in Germany, had full rights of citizenship and every legal status they would need to fit into German society, anti-Semitism was simply part of the fabric of German society. It was immensely more difficult for Jews to gain elite academic positions, connections in prestigious social circles, or other status indicators of high culture and society. Even the Germans that didn't hold overtly anti-Semitic views rarely had any Jewish friends or associated with Jews in any significant way. Many Jews in this era simply converted out of Judaism because it was just easier to fit in and have the kind of life that you would want. Why fight to hold on to an identity that was more trouble than it was worth? Particularly an identity that barely meant anything to you in the first place. This was the mentality of Franz Rosenzweig in 1913 when he was 26 years old. He was encouraged by a close friend and confidant to convert to Christianity. Rosenzweig decided he would do so after observing a trend at the time, to be an observant Jew for a year and then be baptized after one last High Holy Days experience. So in Yom Kippur in 1913, he went to services at a small Orthodox synagogue in Berlin, intending for that to be his final act as a Jew. Well, you know what they say about our best laid intentions. Franz Rosenzweig emerged out of those Yom Kippur services a changed man. He had a deeply meaningful and mystical experience in that synagogue. and he decided there and then that he would remain and forever be a dedicated Jew. As a result of his newfound faith, Franz Rosenzweig became a theologian, translator, philosopher, and one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. His most seminal work, The Star of Redemption, which outlines his theology of God, Torah, and Israel, is still taught in rabbinical seminaries to this day, and his reflections on observance and halakha are foundational in contemporary Jewish thought. Now, you might be asking yourself, what happened in those Yom Kippur services that so thoroughly moved Rosenzweig's heart? What was it that changed the mind of a man so bound and determined to leave Judaism? Well, the answer to that question is ultimately a mystery. Rosenzweig never told anyone why those services so deeply affected him. But I may have a guess. Perhaps it was the spiritual exaltation of the Day of Atonement, a day that is so filled with joy at the reconciliation between God and our people and people with each other. Perhaps it was the music, the beauty of prayer and melodies that have been sung for generations and centuries. Perhaps it was the utter elation of feeling that he was truly coming home, returning to his sacred community, returning to his people, returning to himself. Whatever it was, sitting in that synagogue on the holiest day of the year reminded young Rosenzweig that his Judaism was important to him, something joyful to him, and something that he could not imagine living without. As I think about Franz Rosenzweig and his return to Judaism, the message for this moment is very clear to me. The only way that we can and must respond to anti-Semitism is by living our lives boldly and unabashedly with joy. Judaism has to be something that we are proud of, something we are grateful for, and something that we love about ourselves. This is the message of Professor Deborah Lipstadt, the former United States Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism. In a recent op-ed, she writes, "Combating anti-Semitism needs to sprout from a place of positivity. We must know what we are protecting from assault. We must be motivated far more by our love of our Judaism than by the fight against those who harbor an insane hatred of it. My greatest desire this Rosh Hashanah is that we do a sincere accounting of the beauty and power and wisdom of Judaism and all its values." Ultimately, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is not something that any of us in this room have control over. It does not matter how much we assimilate into American culture or if we strictly hold on to our culture and our traditions. It does not matter whether we embrace Israel or whether we reject and repudiate Israel. Anti-Semitism will still exist. It is not an us problem. It is a them problem. The only thing that we can do is live out Deborah Lipstadt's vision to be our full Jewish selves. We have to be proud of who we are. And most of all, we have to embody joy. Joy, or simcha, is a fundamental part of being a Jew. Every Shabbat, every holiday is sanctified, made holy, and separate through wine, because bringing gladness and joy to our hearts is an act of holiness. The Passover Seder cannot conclude before the consumption of 4 glasses of wine. It is a sacred obligation to rejoice with a wedding couple. And when you witness the horror at a wedding or a bar bat mitzvah with all the theatrics of getting lifted in the chair, you know how seriously we Jews take the obligation to bring joy to others. For us Jews, joy is not just an emotion that elevates simchas and holy days. It is a deeply spiritual act. Joy helps us transcend ourselves and forge lines of connection to each other, to community, to God, to something bigger than ourselves. And most of all, in a world where we Jews can feel so disempowered, so ignored, so unjustly maligned, Joy is the most profound way that we can use our agency to reclaim our power. So what does it look like to use joy as a pathway towards empowerment? Our rabbis in the Midrash show us one answer to this question. They comment on the beginning of the book of Exodus. Pharaoh has enslaved the Israelites and embittered their hearts with harsh labor. But the people were still fruitful and multiplied, so that Pharaoh grew fearful of them. And so Pharaoh decreed a genocide against the Israelites. All the male babies would be drowned in the Nile. In response to Pharaoh's decree, the Midrash teaches that the Israelite men sank into depression and despair. They questioned, why should we even bother to continue if our children are just going to be killed? We should divorce our wives so that they never become pregnant, and we won't have to suffer the loss of our children. But even as the men were despairing and sinking into intractable hopelessness in this moment of darkness, our rabbis teach that it was the women who rose to the occasion and brought redemption to Israel. Rabbi Akiva taught, the women went out to the river to draw water, and God directed fish to go into their pitchers, so their pitchers were half filled with water and half filled with fish. They cooked the fish and heated the water, and when their husbands would come home from their labors, they fed them meals of fish, and they bathed them, and they anointed them, and then they would be intimate with them between the mounds of the field. And when the time came for them to give birth, they went out to the fields under the apple trees. The women convinced their husbands not to divorce them, despite Pharaoh's decree. And so Amram remarried Yocheved, who gave birth to Moses. Now I recognize that this midrash comes from a deeply patriarchal worldview. The women are forced to shoulder the burden of domestic work, while themselves being enslaved to serve their husbands. And we might ask, while they bring joy to the men, who's looking out for their well-being? But looking beyond all that, there is something powerful in what these women did for their husbands. Yes, they cooked for them, bathed them, made love to them, but they did so much more than that. Pharaoh's totalitarian regime was trying to stamp Jewish existence off the face of the earth by dehumanizing them. And these women, in their small acts of kindness, were rehumanizing them, giving them the smallest modicum of dignity, making them feel joyful, giving them a reason to live. It is a powerful illustration that when we face oppression, when we are confronted with the forces that want to erase us, joy is an act of resistance. The power of joy can also be seen in the way that it brings us as a people together. Back in 2004, something remarkable happened for the Jewish people. It was at the Summer Olympics in Athens. Israeli windsurfer Gal Friedman was competing in the windsurfing competition. He had previously won bronze in 1996, and he returned to compete in 2004. He was not favored in the event, but over 11 grueling rounds, Friedman came out on top, winning Israel its first ever gold medal. In Israel and across the Jewish world, this was monumental, as Gal Friedman's victory felt like a victory for every Jew in the world. For the first time ever, the world would get to hear Hatikva played at a medal ceremony. And when the music played, Jews across the world wept tears of utter joy. There's so many things that went into that feeling in that moment. Hearing the Israeli national anthem at the Olympics was a moment where it really felt like we Jews had arrived, that we were a part of the international community, that we were a part of history, and that our existence meant something. The joy of the moment was also a moment of triumph for a community that held so much trauma. Every Israeli and every Jew holds the pain of what happened to the 1972 Israeli team in Munich. And in 2004, the recent memory of the Second Intifada was fresh and raw. In so many ways, Gal Friedman on the medal podium was a hopeful image of what could be. A Jewish world united in pride and joy. Israel not maligned and in conflict, but an essential part of the brotherhood of nations, all striving for a common cause, bonded together in our common humanity. This moment demonstrated the way that hate and division drive us apart, but joy is what brings us back together. I was reminded of this truth over the summer as our community was dealing with the fallout of pulling out of Pride. The decision we made was agonizing. We tried to make our case to the Pride board that headlining a performer who had advocated for violence against Jews was wrong. We tried to explain that in the wake of the murders at the DC Jewish Museum, that our community did not feel safe with Pride endorsing someone who says globalize the Intifada. We tried to explain our hurt, our disappointment, and our feelings of humiliation as a community that had been supportive of Pride and marched in the parade for nearly 3 decades. And all of that fell on deaf ears to a board far more interested in making political statements than in creating inclusive and embracing community. We pulled out of Pride because we felt we had no other choice. The powerlessness that our Jewish community felt in that moment was devastating. And as we pulled out, I know many of us were filled with sadness, disgust, and brokenness in our hearts. But what came next, I think, demonstrates the power of our resilience and the joyful magnificence of our community. Instead of wallowing in our hurt, we pulled together and created J-Pride, an entire weekend of celebration. The JCC created a carnival with food, music, arts, craft, bouncy houses that entire families rejoiced in. Our synagogue hosted brunch with an outrageous drag performer. And our Friday night Pride Shabbat was one of the great spiritual experiences of the year for me and for many of you. For the first time, rabbis did not lead Shabbat at their home synagogues. They came together, bringing communities across San Diego County together. The music lifted our hearts. We had elected officials speak at the service and show their support for our community. And the room was packed with nearly 1,000 people. The joy in that Shabbat service was electric. And in that moment of togetherness, I was reminded that even in our darkest moments, we do not stand alone. In our joy, we see that we are a strong community, a resilient community, a community that will always show up for each other and for others, a community whose spirit can never be defeated, never be silenced. Today I've spoken about how joy can bring us pride and meaning. Joy can be an act of resistance against oppression, and joy can bring us together as a community. As I conclude today, I want to focus on one more aspect of joy. Joy can be the key to our survival. I want to share with you the story of Charlotte Solomon. Charlotte was born in April of 1917 in Berlin. Her father, Alfred Solomon, was a surgeon, and her mother was timid and troubled. When Charlotte was only 8 years old, her mother died by suicide. And she would come to learn later in life that she came from a family of profound mental illness. Multiple aunts and grandparents also died by their own hand. In her childhood, Charlotte seemed lacking in promise and was so indistinct that one of her childhood friends described her as having no qualities at all. In her teenage years, however, it was discovered that she had a talent for art. In 1936, she gained admittance to the United States Schools for Pure and Applied Arts at a time when Jewish quotas in Germany were held at 1.5%. She studied there for a year until Jews were barred from higher education entirely in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. It was then that Charlotte and her family fled Germany and settled in the outskirts of Nice, France, in a beach cottage owned by an American, Ottilie Moore, who sheltered a number of Jewish children during the war. Charlotte and her grandfather were briefly interned at a prison camp in the Pyrenees by French authorities, but were later released due to her grandfather's infirmity. It was at this moment in 1941 that Charlotte had a nervous breakdown. So overcome by the trauma of her family's dark legacy of mental illness and suicide, the state of living as refugees during the outset of World War II, the horrific experience in the prisoner camp, and her own mental illness, Charlotte had reached the breaking point. She contemplated taking her own life, feeling a deep sense of hopelessness. It was then that her doctor told her, "You must paint." And paint she did. And it was in painting that Charlotte saved herself. Painting brought her from the edge of the precipice. It gave her purpose in life. It sparked her creativity. And it brought back joy to her heart. Painting was the way that she reclaimed her humanity in a world so bound and determined to dehumanize her. What she created is a work so unique that it requires a paragraph to describe what it actually is. Over the course of 2 years, between 1941 and 1942, Charlotte created 765 paintings. They were all 10 by 13-inch gouaches, a kind of thick watercolor. She arranged these paintings into a libretto, and the work as a whole she described as an operetta. The paintings became a piece of theater, a play. The illustration set the scene, and Charlotte added captions, stage directions, and even musical notation. The play was autobiographical, though she changed the names of all of her characters, naming herself Charlotte Kahn. She comments on the other characters, though she does not speak in the first person. An offstage narrator, a kind of Greek chorus of sorts, keeps the story moving. Through this play told in paintings, we learn about her childhood, the trauma of the death of her mother, her journey through art school, and her time living in France. She titles the work as a whole, Life or Theater. The most striking image we get is the signature painting of the play, the final image in the epilogue. The picture portrays Charlotte knelt down on her knees, paintbrush in her right hand, her left holding a canvas. In front of her, striking blue, the ocean. On her back is written the title of the work, Leben oder Theater, Life or Theater. She wrote in her journal about this time in her life, "The war raged on, and I sat by the sea and saw deep into the heart of humankind." Charlotte's story, like so many others during the Holocaust, is one that ends in tragedy. She and her husband were discovered in their hiding in 1943 and deported to the death camps. She arrived in Auschwitz in April of 1943, and at the time she was 5 months pregnant. She was immediately selected for death and was murdered in the gas chambers shortly after she arrived. Right before she was deported to her death, Charlotte went to her doctor and handed him a package addressed to Ottilie Moore, who had hidden her family. She said to her doctor, "Keep this safe. It is my whole life." In that package was the entire collection of her paintings. The paintings were saved from the destruction of the Holocaust, and they have been on display in museums in Holland and France, the United States, Germany, Israel, and Japan. Life or Theater has been published in 4 languages with all 765 color plates, and her story has been brought to life in 4 films. Because of Charlotte and her artwork, we have the most penetrating visual record from the Nazi era of a single life. Painting and the joy that it embodied saved Charlotte in every way possible. It brought her back from the edge of the abyss of hopelessness and gave her the strength to carry on in the darkest of times. And her artwork became her legacy, the one thing that could not be destroyed. Because of her art, the world will forever know that there was a woman named Charlotte Solomon. Her life though robbed from her by the cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazis, will never be lost to history, and she will continue to inspire through her joy and her profound resilience. In the postscript to Life or Theater, Charlotte writes directly about herself the only time in the whole work in which she confesses, "I was all the characters in my play, and thus I became myself." That line is precisely the message we need to take from this moment. In the act of painting, in the act of creating, in the act of embodying her joy and her purpose, Charlotte became herself. In a world that was trying to destroy her, Charlotte found a way to become herself. That is why we Jews have to find joy and pride and solidarity in ourselves and in our community. In our joy, we save ourselves. In our celebration of who we are, we become ourselves. I know that it's not easy to be a Jew. The world will never let it be easy for us to be who we are. But we cannot allow the challenge of our times to cause us to lose ourselves. Because when we can use joy to become ourselves, we have the power to tap into a world of self-fulfillment, purpose, and transcendent meaning. And what could possibly be more fabulous than that?